So welcome to everybody who have come to hear more about expanded access and compassionate use. Again, we've got a panel discussion. The intent today is that we want this to be very interactive. I'm going to be presenting a few slides up front talking about the environment of expanded access, some of the history, and then we've got a series of questions that we'll be talking about with the other panelists. We tend to find in these settings that it's more interesting when we're getting questions from the floor. And so that can be right away. It can be at the end if you want to put your hand up and ask a question. But we do want this to be very interactive. Again, the panelists are there and they've already been introduced. But just to give some perspective on expanded access, if you live in the United States, the reality is that you have some of the best access to innovative medicines compared to other people in the world. But, and it is a big but, there are going to be times where patients with unmet medical needs find themselves in a situation where maybe a new medicine is being tested for their disease. They can't get into a clinical trial. They don't qualify. And frankly, waiting until that medicine is approved by the FDA is not an option. It's going to be too late. So how has expanded access evolved over the last 30 years in the United States? Going back to the mid-'80s, it started out really with the HIV/AIDS movement. There was a movie that came out in 2013. Matthew McConaughey won a Best Actor Oscar for portraying a gentleman by the name of Ron Woodruff. And Ron was a patient, an AIDS patient in Dallas in the mid-'80s who was very insistent that there had to be better options for him than what, going through the existing trials or the existing medicines that were available, and became aware of some of the experimental medicines available in Mexico. And actually went down into Mexico, procured a supply of this medicine, smuggled it back across the border, and then started distributing it to AIDS patients in the Dallas area just to give them hope. And if you haven't seen the movie, I do recommend that you see it because it really is a very poignant example of what a patient is willing and capable of doing. Of course, at that time, and it was very clear that there was a lot of opposition coming from the FDA and other government agencies, and so Ron and his group were put under lots of negative things that were happening to them. But at the end of the day, Ron and then future other advocacy groups had a big impact on what FDA did subsequently. In 1987, issued the first laws on expanded access. Kind of went along for several years until not much was happening. There was occasional access programs were happening, but not much. And then early 2000s, there was a girl by the name of Abigail Burroughs who was diagnosed with cancer, had run out of all treatment options, and had petitioned to gain access to some medicines and was denied, and ultimately died. And an organization that Steve Walker represents today, Abigail Alliance, was formed, and they subsequently sued the FDA, and Van Eschenbach was the then commissioner of the FDA. The suit was unsuccessful, but it raised a lot of awareness about what is the issue of access for patients with unmet medical needs. Subsequent to that, the FDA has issued further guidelines on expanded access. Probably the biggest change was allowing companies in 2009 to start charging for investigative medicines under an expanded access program. But we'll talk a little bit later why that in itself hasn't really made a big difference, because many of the loopholes that FDA still has in place for that. And then more recently, there was some discussion about the 21st Century Cures Act this morning already. I'll touch briefly on that later. But this picture is a picture of, and it actually tying back to Abigail Alliance, it was interesting looking at their website and how they built awareness. It was getting newspaper articles written, getting TV interviews done. To build awareness back in even 2000, 15 years ago, was a significantly different prospect than today, where from a social media perspective, if there's so much more information out there, right, in terms of information on the internet. And so this case was a famous case, Josh Hardy, 2014, asking company Chimerix, his mother, asking for access to this drug for this rare cancer. The company said no. And it was a firestorm of social media, and ultimately the CEO left the company. Josh did get access to the drug. Kind of a sad footnote I saw in the news this last evening that Josh passed away yesterday. So it's a famous case from an access perspective, but he died now at 10 years old, and it is a very sad ending. But it did help. Getting access to this product did help prolong his life additional 2 years. So how does expanded access work? And I know these are how-to sessions. The reality is we're not going to get deep into the nuts and bolts of expanded access. We partnered, and several other organizations partnered with Global Genes in the last couple of years to develop some patient toolkits. And I've got, here's hard copies of these can be obtained, as well as they're all available on Global Genes' website. So I would refer you to those toolkits. I think they're a good reference point to understand how does expanded access work in the US. The one on the right is if you're a Canadian patient, and how does the special access program work for Canada. A couple other pieces of legislation that are out there right now you may have heard of in the lay press. Right to Try organization out of Arizona called the Goldwater Institute is trying to get state legislators and across the country to pass this legislation that essentially gives patients with seriously or terminally ill conditions an opportunity to gain access to life-saving medicines, ultimately circumventing the rules of the FDA. And it's really kind of a libertarian perspective of protecting the fundamental right to take any risk you want as a patient. I think we were talking earlier, Steve said that there is actually a physician now in Texas that has used this on up to about 78 patients, I think you said. The reality with Right to Try is that it may not do anything different than the existing FDA guidelines because there's still going to be the same blocks in place for Right to Try that are for expanded access. And there's also some federal legislation going in. I'm not going to touch on the 21st Century Cures Act, with the exception to say that it does contain some provisions to hopefully speed up the process for drugs that, in terms of access and getting better access and faster access for drugs for conditions where there's no cures currently available. And then in terms of the access landscape, there's many, many more drugs available or being developed for rare diseases. I think back 10 years, 15 years ago, it was non-existent. It felt like it was non-existent being in the rare disease space. Certainly because of the proliferation of information on the internet, patients and advocates have so much more availability of information about the disease, about treatments coming along, and it's really putting pressure on pharmaceutical companies and on regulatory bodies to figure out how to deal with this. The FDA continues to evolve and improve processes. The reality is it's still an onerous for stakeholders, and we were talking with Steve earlier, and FDA quotes 99% of requests get fulfilled, and that's probably true. The reality is there's so many other things that don't get to their desk, where maybe a patient or patient advocate is asked the company, can you help us on this? And the answer is no or not now. And so it's part of I would say, a flawed system. The system is broken to some degree, and just because maybe the system we have isn't designed for expanded access, but rather for development of clinical trials and FDA approvals. And I would say in our experience, I didn't give much information, but Clinigen has a division called ITIS. And ITIS, we partner with pharmaceutical companies to help make drugs available on an expanded access basis globally. And in our experience, we see that pharma companies are becoming more proactive to think about solutions. But even when they have a solution in place and they're willing to make their drug available, it's still a very onerous process and daunting for either a patient or a clinician to do that. And then my last slide before we get into the questions. I would say that much of innovation in the rare disease space is coming from small biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and that's not a bad thing, but which I'll talk about in a minute why that is. But the reality for companies of any size, not just small companies, is to try to get their drug through the clinical trial process and get the drug approved by FDA, because at the end of the day, the most number of patients potentially can benefit at that point. But small companies have limited resources in terms of people and money. In our experience, large companies with expanded access programs will tend to give the drug away free of charge, but in the case of small companies, that's not possible just because of the restriction on the resources that they have. And so it becomes a barrier, especially in the United States, given some of the rules in place for expanded access. Another thing that we see in our business is oftentimes the small companies aren't thinking about, are we going to receive these requests? And if we do, how are we going to respond to them? So they get caught off guard, much like the Chimerix case that I mentioned earlier. They just weren't ready to sort out how they are going to be doing that. And just like the Chimerix case, it creates conflict when these companies don't have a clear access policy, and really makes them look like the bad guy when they're unresponsive or say no. And we've seen a number of cases, and they're famous cases where companies, they're getting all these requests and they just don't respond. And there's, from a patient or advocate perspective, there's nothing more frustrating when you don't have a company that's at least willing to acknowledge your request. So I think it's important. And one of the things that we're really trying to do, we at Clinigen and ITIS are doing is helping companies develop access policies so that when a patient has an inquiry about how does this work, are you, generally for drugs that are in development with your company, they can go to your website, they can see how that works, and it makes it clear, that when they may be doing that. They may say, well, we're going to wait until after phase 3 trials are done, then we're going to do it. But at least it starts setting some expectations for patients and patient advocates. And my last point before we jump into the questions, generally we live in a country here in the States at least where clinicians are able to prescribe medicines that are FDA approved. Outside of teaching hospitals, it's not, they're not used to having to go through this process. And so it can be a difficult time. You might have a difficult time finding clinicians, who are maybe willing to go through this process. They're taking on some additional responsibilities and liability. That's not to say, I'm not trying to cast negativity on the healthcare profession, but it is something that it's another barrier for access for patients to get some of these medicines. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Miller, and Deborah's got a few slides that she's going to present as well. I hope so.
Okay, hi. Thank you. So since the title of this session is about more of a how-to for the patient advocates and families, I think starting off with just kind of a really basic understanding of how do you go about getting expanded access. What are the steps? And I think there's 3 primary parties that have to agree: the patient, the FDA, and the company, the sponsor company. And so it's a process usually of a single patient, of just the physician requesting and filling out an application and sending it to the FDA. If it's a larger group, it's a different form that has to be submitted to the FDA. And then it comes down to, the company, and the company obviously has to agree, along with the physician, that this is doable. And that's where, as John said, it gets really dicey, just because a large pharmaceutical company that has, a stockpile of drugs may have the capacity to provide free drug to a large group of patients. When you're talking about a small biotech company that is struggling to survive without an approved drug, they have one single drug they're working on, they have no revenue stream, and it's virtually impossible for them to fund an expanded access program. So, that's the problem. What's the solution? And in the Duchenne space, most of the companies that we're working with are small biotech companies with a single drug that they're working on. So, what is the solution? And I know that we we have felt very strongly that advocacy is really important from the patient community in terms of lobbying FDA, making sure that the patient voice is heard. But I think something else is really important for the patients to understand is that the reason a lot of these biotech companies are struggling as much as they are is because they don't have the proper funding to get started. And the more that the patient community can come together, use their resources, their contacts, and raise money to help fund these biotech companies in the early stages, will that help fund an expanded access program? I don't know. But will it help them move through the clinical trial process quicker to actually get approved drugs, which is what we really want? Probably yes. I know in the case of Sarepta that just got approved this week, which was incredible news for the Duchenne community, and I think for all rare diseases. Resources, money was such an issue for them for so many years. And I think it really stretched out the clinical trial process just because of not being able to do a fully powered trial right off and go through, a quick phase 3 trial. So, I think that resources are one way that a patient community can help hurry this along. So just some of the challenges for expanded access. Obviously, the FDA. Even if the FDA approves it, it's still some of their policies still make it difficult for the companies to be able to do this. So if a drug company is going to be liable for something that happens outside of a clinical trial with expanded access, and if indeed that, if there's an adverse event and that's going to be held against the trial results, then that's going to obviously dampen the enthusiasm of companies to participate in a trial like this. So there are regulatory issues that could be changed to make it more attractive for biotech and pharmaceutical companies to participate in an expanded access program. Who pays for it? I mean, that's really the big question in the world that I operate in the small biotech companies. And, would it be easier if the patients could pay for it? Very possibly, but at the same time, the drugs we're talking about they're not just expensive to deliver. We've seen the price tags, between $200,000 and $500,000 a year, so not too many people can afford that. And it's not just, heavy-handed pricing on the company's part. It takes a lot of money to make these drugs. For example, the Morpholino technology, you start off with a huge, quantity of product and through many steps distill it down to a little vial. And so, is it realistic to expect, a company to produce all that, when they're not even making a profit? And insurance companies at this point won't cover this. So that's another perhaps policy issue that could be addressed, is working with the payers. And then it comes down to, the ethics. Who gets the drug? Who's the one that's going to make that decision? If a whole patient population can't get the drug because of expense or because of, affecting the clinical trial enrollment, then who's going to make that choice of who gets the drug? Is it going to be the sickest kids? Is it going to be the ones that can benefit the most? And so these are just all issues, and I wish I was standing here with an answer on all of these, but I think that these are things that together as, individual patient groups, and I think, with Global Genes, the rare disease community should actually, be working very closely, not only with the FDA, but with, insurance companies and with sponsor companies. And there are examples, for example, Marathon Pharmaceuticals is here, and they've created, I think, a very, very effective expanded access program to transition patients off of an imported drug onto, hopefully, an FDA-approved drug here very shortly. But it's taken a lot of thought, a lot of effort, and a lot of investment and expense on the company's part to do it. So there are solutions, and so we applaud innovative thinking. And there is so much innovation going on, which is wonderful about this country. It's a little difficult for the FDA to keep up with that innovation, but it's our job to help them do their best to do that.
Okay. So I'm going to actually turn first to Kristina and ask you about kind of, in your experience from a pharma perspective, what are some of the key considerations that a pharmaceutical company would have when they're thinking about an expanded access program for a new drug?
So this will be my opinion in working as both a consultant in the pharma and biotech industry and then as an employee in patient advocacy. You know, each disease state is so different. The needs of the patients are so different, the severity of the disease. So looking, you know, Deborah, you hit on so many of the things, you both hit on so many of the things, the liability issues, unfortunately the financial issues, the rules and regulations that we have to think about, because the goal for every company I have ever worked with is to bring good medicines to as many people that need it as quickly as possible. So, you know, the kind of, that there isn't a clear-cut system or regulations from the FDA, and that each company really has to look at it as kind of an individual decision is very hard. And companies at different stages, from a financial perspective, from a resource perspective, have to look at this with those filters. So I wish there were an easy answer. But unfortunately, at this point, there isn't. I think the thing that we really have to do is work together as advocates, including, you know, all of the stakeholders working together in clear communication. We talked about this, you know, before this session, that communication is the key. It's the key to everything. And for a company really having to explain and sit down and talk about the challenges and help the patient community understand, you know, the process, the lack of process, the challenges, you know, what could happen, and have the patient community also communicate that back to their patients and their members, I think is really important.
And then just a follow-on question, from a best practice perspective, how do you think, there have been examples of companies not handling expanded access, or are there some things that companies could be thinking about? I know it's a different type of audience here, but from your perspective, different things that they could be doing?
For me, number one is to actually have a policy. So before you need a policy for the company to come together and create a policy that is public on the website, that can be communicated, knowing that that policy can change over time, that is not set in stone, but is a guidepost for the way the company thinks about and is approaching the decisions.
Steve, I guess from your perspective, you know, when you guys get requests from patients maybe who are diagnosed early on, what are some of the challenges that you see that some of those patients are facing?
Sure, and before I answer that, I know that sometimes when companies tell you it's difficult to do this, it sounds like double talk, because you don't really understand what they're up against, but it's true. And the reality is that in some ways, the companies, in fact in many ways, the companies are victims of a system that is built not to work. And their ability to provide access is inextricably intertwined with what they have to do to get their drug approved. Yesterday at the Right to Try hearing, Peter Lurie from the FDA, at the end of his testimony, implored the committee to consider expanded access and right to try, access to investigational drugs, as being completely separate from the sacrosanct way we develop drugs and design trials and come up with endpoints. And as anyone who knows about these two subjects, they are inextricably intertwined. So without modifying the way we develop drugs and making it more possible for companies to, and for it to just make more sense for companies to do this, because the people do want to do it. They're human beings and they want to, I mean, they're in it to save lives. We need to change the way we develop drugs and the way we rank the priority of progress delivery against, you know, clinical trials. Progress delivery at the FDA is ranked at a much lower level than getting their data and getting their p-values and plodding through their process and being careful and overestimating risk and underestimating benefit. So they're caught up in an unpredictable process in which they may have a drug that works and they don't know if it's ever going to be approved or when it's going to be approved. So I want to point out something that before I get to the best practices or sort of the challenges, because I've tried to work through this with hundreds of people, including my late wife, which is why I'm an advocate. The Duchenne community kind of wrote the book on how to do this, and they did it over the last 3 years, and we were involved at the beginning of that process by taking them to a couple of meetings with Woodcock and Hamburg, and that got the ball rolling. Instead of becoming adversarial with the company because the company couldn't provide their drug immediately, they partnered with the company. They learned everything, well, they knew a lot about their disease, but they learned everything there was to know about their disease, including the technical side, the medical side, the molecular side. They agreed with Sarepta that Sarepta wasn't going to be able to do a meaningful access program, and they also weren't going to be able to satisfy the FDA's requirements for a very large randomized controlled trial with placebos in which boys would progress and die. They just weren't going to do that, and there weren't enough boys to do what the FDA wanted. So in that atmosphere of reality, the company and the patients, with the patients literally running interference, like down linemen in front of the company through the FDA with their elbows out. That's how that approval happened the other day based on a 12-patient trial. Now, they still have some battles to fight, but as patients, you're much better off and more likely to succeed in both your desire to get access and also to get your drug approved if you partner with the company. Remember, the company has the drug. They're the only ones that can help you. The FDA doesn't have the drug. So I can't say that all companies respond appropriately, and when they don't, they deserve to be slapped, but by the patient community. But when they do, listen to them, understand, and develop a relationship of trust, and then work with them, and maybe you can find a way to make both access and the development program work. So it's much more productive to do that. Now on challenges, you heard some of the challenges. The most common one is the company just isn't doing it for some of the reasons you've heard. And a really important one is cost. If you're a drug company that has investor cash and you have a burn rate and you're on the edge of extinction all the time, you're trying to get your drug approved, putting the money and effort into making more drug and distributing it outside your clinical program is just really not possible. So it might be the right thing to do, but it's not a possible thing to do, which comes to the question of paying for this and the question of balancing progress versus development. We do need to find a way to pay for this because biotechs are doing the most exciting work and they really don't have the resources. So patients can't always pay for it, so we need another way to pay for it. And there are ways to pay for things. And there's insurance, there's user fees, there's philanthropy, there's ways to do it. We just need to get to work on how to pay for it. The most common challenge I think that patients and companies face, and I'm not a person who says nice things about organizations and people when they don't deserve it. It's the FDA. Our expanded access programs are mainly dysfunctional solely and completely because of the way the FDA regulates drug development. All their protests notwithstanding, everything you hear from them is a half-truth, and they know it is. So when you listen to Richard Klein talk about 99 requests are approved, he's talking about completed applications, not requests. And you all know that you've tried to get drugs and never got to the point of filling out an application, but you made a request. So the demand is much larger than the FDA pretends. They also refuse to acknowledge that the behind-the-scenes dealings with the drug companies in terms of the trials they're going to need, the uncertainty of approval, whether more trials might be added, whether an adverse event seen in an access program might not result in a clinical hold, but could result in a requirement for another trial that would delay the approval of the drug. To drug companies, that's enormously impactful because if you're racing another company to the finish line and they get there first, so it's all of these things are real problems for the drug companies. It's not really about risk and benefit, as we all know, with these diseases. The potential benefit of a drug when you have a terminal disease or a progressive disease that's going to cripple you against a drug that's gotten through phase 1 and didn't kill anybody and maybe caused a little nausea, it pales in comparison to the potential for benefit because doing nothing, we all know what happens. I mean, disaster. The FDA doesn't weight the risk of the disease appropriately either. So if you want to make single patient INDs, which is one doctor asking for one drug for one patient, which even the FDA agrees is no way to get drugs to more than a few people, and you want expanded access programs to be more available, then the patient community has to do what the Duchenne community did. You have to go in en masse with your elbows out to the FDA with the drug company and force change. So the unfortunate truth is patients come to the Abigail Alliance after running out of options, asking for a drug and realizing they can't get it, wondering why. And then our job is to educate them on what I just told you, and there's a great deal more than that you need to know, because you need to know why the system doesn't work before you can go fight your battle. And often what you end up having to do is the doors are not open, and what you have to do is go to the Wall Street Journal, go to your local news channel, and get attention. Now, the unfair thing that happens, and I'm going to stop here in a second, but the unfair thing that happens then is the FDA blames the drug company. And it's your job as patients to make sure they don't get away with that. Because if you let them get away with it, quite frankly, to use blunt language, you're screwed. You will never get the drug. So the company has the drug. You need the drug. The company may want to give it to you, but for many reasons they can't. Help them. So that's my message.
I wanted to say one thing that you touched on also, and just kind of expand on it. So yeah, change within the FDA, you know, it's a government agency that obviously is going to need to grow and develop with the technology of the products we're creating. You mentioned the liability. So if a company, so the risk benefit, so the FDA, you know, if they're looking at risk benefit or they're not looking at risk benefit, there's still the factor that a company, if there's an adverse event, somebody dies, the company's still going to get sued. I don't care how many waivers you sign. The company's still going to get sued, and it could put them out of business. So yes, the FDA, you know, there's room for improvement. There's also, you know, whether it's tort reform or whatever, that if somebody signs a waiver, they mean it, and that the company can't be held liable. And I'm not sure that that's ever going to happen. I don't know.
I'm told the Supreme Court would never allow it.
Never allow?
They would not
Allow to not be sued?
support a waiver under those circumstances.
Yeah.
And not for negligence, maybe for an impact only of the drug, but if you can get any kind of a negligence claim in there, then those waivers wouldn't hold up.
Right.
So the other thing we have to do as patients is go into this understanding that we're already in a situation of tremendous risk.
Yeah.
And accept that risk, because you're going to the company and asking for help. And if something bad happens, well, it's an early stage drug.
But still,
Yeah.
you're going to get sued.
Right.
Yeah.
I just want to check and see if we have any questions from the audience. Anybody want to put their hand up? Kathy, up here in front.
My name's Kathy, and I'm here as a patient advocate for primary biliary cholangitis. We got the first new drug treatment in 40 years approved in May. And I have to say the pharma company was incredible about setting up patient assistance programs before the drug was even approved. They had policies in place and programs in place to assist patients and doctors to get access to that medicine as soon as we got it approved. The day it hit the market, those programs were already running. And I think it's a great model, small pharma company, but they set it up right. They listened to the patient community and realized doing it right up front is going to save a ton of time, money, and aggravation later. And we can say nothing but the greatest of things because they engaged with all of us to do that.
Which company? Which company?
Which company?
Intercept Pharmaceutical.
Actually, it's a good follow-on discussion for you, Deborah, in terms of engagement with pharmaceutical companies. Have you seen other good practices in the Duchenne space that you can speak to and what that would look like?
So I can't say that we have, other than Marathon, which I think is a success story in terms of, you know, developing an innovative expanded access program. But other than that, I don't really know of any expanded access programs right now. And again, it's just because we're dealing, for the most part, with very small single product biotech companies.
Other questions?
Sorry, this is a comment, and just to get your reaction to, what I see as a big problem in this space is the lack of patient engagement in the initial clinical trial design. So if that initial clinical trial is designed poorly, then the patients see how long it's taking to get data that may not be correct, and then they're waiting and watching a good drug take a long time. So if I could urge anyone here in the pharma industry, it would be to make sure that that first trial is designed very, very well with patient involvement, because when patients see all that delay, that's when they start really pushing for compassionate use. And obviously I speak from personal experience.
So we had a
in
call
our
before
trial.
the meeting, and Steve was very passionate about this, and I see him kind of like going like this over there right now, so I better pass the mic.
One of the truths about our clinical trial design paradigm right now is that it's 50 years old. And it's based on simplistic comparisons of median outcomes in a treatment group and a control group. So what you really know at the end of the trial is the median patient in the treatment arm saw this much improvement, as opposed to the median patient in the control arm. So if you have 100 people in each arm, 99 in each arm were there solely for the purpose of determining who the median patient was. But everything that happened in the trial is actually what happened to all 100. And the variance in the trial, which statisticians look at with 95% confidence intervals and variances and p-values, actually does not inform a clinician with respect to who should get the drug or whether it will work. So it gives you odds. So if and this happens commonly in cancer, at least it used to, if 10% of the patients see their tumor shrink, but the drug gets approved because it was slightly better than the control, 90% of the patients who receive the drug get no benefit, they only get side effects. Now, why nobody was against that was because it creates an enormous market for your drug, right? So you get to sell it to 90 people for whom it's a toxic placebo to get to the 10% that will benefit. The crudeness of the randomized controlled trial is stunning. It's a terrible way to figure out whether a drug works or not, and who should get it and who should not.
Especially in rare diseases where your trials may be 15
right,
and
it's
N of 1.
impossible. So your point about designing an adequate clinical trial, a good clinical trial, if you will, is locked into this concept that it has to produce a meaningless statistical metric called a p-value, which makes it impossible to design a meaningful trial. What you're doing is you're designing a trial that the biostatisticians at the FDA will accept as evidence of effectiveness. So whenever anyone talks about designing an adequate trial, okay, we're stuck with the reality that we have to design trials and run them to a level of rigor, which is another word that drives me crazy as a scientist. I have a 30-year career in the environmental field. I'm a geologist, but I'm also an advocate for 16 years. The idea that we have to do this to get the drug approved is a reality. But another thing you need to do when you go into the agency with your elbows out is to tell them, we hate these trials. They're stupid, and they're impossible in our patient population, especially in the rare population. We need to do better. And by the way, if you didn't have to enroll a barbaric trial in which your kids were put on placebos under blinded conditions for 2 years, it'd be a lot easier to have expanded access because you wouldn't have to force people into those trials.
Go ahead, yeah.
So, I think I totally agree that designing good clinical trials is really important. And if you're not going to do a placebo-controlled trial, what do you need? You need a natural history that you understand. And in rare disease, at least in Duchenne, it's extremely variable amongst patients. And so we basically sponsored an initiative called CTAP to apply statistical analysis to the patient databases that we have, and not just a 6-minute walk test, but try to compile a lot more information and put a very, very sophisticated analysis overlaid on that to be able to predict what the natural history would be based upon baseline and a whole bunch of different factors. And the CTAP analysis is something that actually was designed, we helped create it in a way that it's transportable to other rare diseases. And so, if you're interested in hearing more about that, our website's just about ready to go up, and it's proving to be, I think we've already published a paper, and this is something I think that patient groups can do. It's like, if you don't want a placebo-controlled trial, let's figure out what the natural history is so that we can help companies design their trials more intelligently and go to the FDA with data that is adequate for them.
Can I add one point?
Sure.
Because that's excellent, you're right. The other thing we need, and one of the first things I learned in baby statistics when I was becoming a geologist from my statistics professor was, when the answer is obvious, don't do statistics. And I mean, it's just a really simple concept. If you already know the answer, don't waste time doing statistics. With eteplirsen, and I think it's a good case, in a very small number of boys, the effect was obvious. Now, it's not obvious to a statistician because the sample isn't large enough. But to anyone who understands the disease and has watched their child's decline and then see it do this and even see it do that a little bit, it's obvious. This drug is doing something. So, and I think that's why the drug got approved. I think that Janet Woodcock, and I go back, she's a mixed bag, and she got a very nice email from me the other day. She doesn't always get nice emails. She's very responsive, by the way. Janet is, I respect her tremendously, and she's very responsive. If you send her an email and she knows who you are, 5 minutes later you get a response. It may not be what you want, but you get a response. So I think what they did was what Janet did was take a weight of evidence approach. And she looked at the data, and it was a small increase in dystrophin. Nobody knows how much of an increase in dystrophin is enough, except that when you see the outcomes, it looks like this is meaningful. I mean, the kids are not being cured, but they're doing better, and it's clear and it's obvious. And then she saw the perception of risk versus benefit and what the community wanted, and that they were willing to agree to, if this drug doesn't work, we understand you're going to have to take it off the market. And all the boxes were checked as far as what Congress told the agency to do with rare disease drugs for terminal conditions for which there are severe unmet medical needs. All the boxes were checked, and she stepped outside the statistical box and said, I want to consider this other information. The way you get them to consider that other information is for you to go in there and literally be in their face from the beginning. And your point about being there at the very beginning of the clinical trial process, the drug companies may not like it, but that's what your elbows are for. Okay, you can request your meeting with the FDA, and if the drug company doesn't want to come with you, they don't have to come. That means you won't be able to talk about a lot of things, and they won't be able to talk about a lot of things because you won't know, and they can't. But you're there, you're telling them what you want. Eventually, the drug company will join you. And then you will get your input.
We're almost out of time here. We've got one question in the back there.
Yeah, thanks. I actually just wanted to make a comment to the advocates that are in the room, and on behalf of Steve, I don't want to sign you up for a lot more work, but the reason I think I'll never forget calling in 2006, calling Steve's compatriot Frank, and talking about my son who had Duchenne and how he had just been diagnosed, and having Frank say to us, when you need us, we will be here, and then having them follow through with that years later. And they were just indispensable for us. So again, I don't want to sign you up for a lot more work, but Abigailance was an indispensable amount of information for us as we navigated through FDA. And we didn't get very far with what we call the Office of Placation. So they opened doors to the right people at FDA. So
Unfortunately, we're free.
yeah. And then I was going to say, just to Deborah's comment about about removing liability, I feel like that happens in the vaccine industry. You know, they have indemnity from lawsuits, so there has to be a way to achieve what you're talking about. And then on the flip side, there has to be, I think, a benefit of these expanded access programs, a way to turn participation in expanded access programs into data, and to help FDA see that this is a way of collecting data rather than have them to look at it as simply anecdotal evidence or case studies. Because in rare disease, every case study is important and valuable, and so there has to be a way to turn that expanded access into data, and so I'm wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Couldn't agree with you more. I think that's the end of our session, getting the look from Kathy there. And I do want to say that we have literally just scratched the surface on both issues and potential solutions. There's a, we talk about a system that isn't working very well, and I think it's starting out talking to groups like Abigail Alliance, Cure Duchenne, other advocacy groups for the diseases that you have, engaging with the pharmaceutical companies, engaging with the agency. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. It's not an easy system necessarily, but there can be a pathway forward. I think for significant change to happen, the almost need a system change of how we do things from a society perspective in drug development. But again, not possible to cover off in 45 minutes, but I want to thank you all for coming up, and certainly we're happy to take questions throughout the rest of the next couple of days. Tricia.
So just one last comment. So great discussion and great from the panel. So thank you. So the two questions, one from the PBC intercept comment as well as the FDA. I think this is one thing I've learned over the past 2 days is really how to more actively engage with the biotech partners and really understanding what their pharmaceutical assistance is. I've been privileged to work in biotech in the past in advocacy roles, and I've worked at rare disease organizations that 97% of their patient population had a zero copay, and that is astounding. So this is something is really about if the cost of the drug is $300,000, the price to you, your cost, may be a lot less than your nasal spray that you buy over the counter. So it's really not being paralyzed by that and learning what your options are. And to your point about the FDA, actively engaging in discussions with them, introducing them, having them hear what your journey is like is instrumental. So,
By the way, for Deja, they're required to talk to you, so be bold. Ask for a meeting with the commissioner. You may not get the commissioner, but you'll get a meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.